As darkness crept over the carnage on Sonlac, word had already begun to spread that Harold, King of England, was slain. After a long fought and grinding battle, William, Duke of Normandy, had triumphed. Yet William's victory at Hastings was only the beginning. Harold Godwinson was dead, as were his brothers Leofwine and Gurth, and much of the cream of the English nobility, but the English were far from ready to meekly submit to the foreign bastard. After landing in late September of 1066, William had begun to dig in, erecting a temporary castle at Pevensey before ravaging the Sussex countryside, but had moved cautiously to near Hastings to await the inevitable response of Harold. On 15th of October 1066, he directly controlled very little territory then, and despite expectations, he was disappointed with the lack of immediate submissions from the remaining English elite. Given the following events and the years of rebellion that characterised William's early reign, William of Poitiers' words that, quote, "the forces of Normandy had subjugated all the cities of the English in a single day," is evidently absurd. Not least among the restless untaken cities was London, which now became a hub of resistance. William of Poitiers stating that, quote, "a crowd of warriors from elsewhere had flocked there, presumably both men still arriving to join Harold's army that had rushed to confront William at Hastings, and most probably survivors from the very same battle too." Hastings was not then the sum of William's conquest. In fact, the English in London showed every sign of rejecting William by electing another king, the teenaged Edgar, known as the Atheling. Edgar was the grandson of King Edmund Ironside, a scion of the native House of Wessex and direct descendant of Alfred the Great. This choice was natural, given the other more martially viable candidates now lay dead on the field. Edgar had been present at court since the reign of his great-uncle, Edward the Confessor. However, with invasion looming early in 1066, the Witan settled on the tested, powerful Harold as the old king's successor. Edgar was supported by the Archbishop of York and the disgruntled Londoners, yet if he was to ever be crowned king, he needed the support of the remaining great men of the kingdom, chiefly Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria respectively. These brothers were not present at Hastings, given they had recently fought the other great invader, Harold Hardrada, at Fulford Gate on September 20th, and had been defeated. It had been their brother-in-law Harold who had marched north to crush the Norwegian threat at Stamford Bridge just 5 days later. The brothers had a stake in Harold's success in that sometime in early 1066 or late 1065, Harold had wedded their sister and a son was born sometime in 1066, which, in all likelihood, would have eventually succeeded him, a scion of both their houses. In late October, that fond hope was dashed, and now the brothers had to throw their lot in with the native challenger, Edgar. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the brothers thus promised that they would fight for him. Meanwhile, William had buried his own dead, while leaving the English to rot where they lay. He tarried around a fortnight in the area, perhaps growing increasingly angry at the dearth of submissions, before striking camp. William thus began his march east, his fury focusing on Romney. A pocket of Anglo-Saxon resistance defied him there, but worse still, the town, according to William of Poitiers, had killed a party of Normans who had landed there by accident during the voyage from Normandy. The fortified town was stormed and torched, as much to set a precedent as to punish them for their deeds. This worked, as Dover, perhaps hearing of Romney's fate, surrendered without resistance. William spent around a week at Dover, fortifying its defences, before moving on. Now he was on the move, and despite his own losses at Hastings, cities did begin sending messages of submission, including the citizens of Canterbury, the home of England's primate. Canterbury's fairly lenient terms of a declaration of fealty and a promise of future rent were probably helped by its habitation by King Edward's widow and the late King Harold's sister, Queen Edith. Despite his reputation as a battle-hardened conqueror, William was aware of what we would call the PR implications, potentially harming such a high-ranking lady, and respected the old king, who was, after all, his cousin. London, though, was not so quick to submit. According to William of Poitiers, William responded to Edgar's election by approaching London and was met with an English sortie from north of the Thames. The Normans thus checked, retaliated by burning everything in sight on the south bank of the Thames. It became clear to William that a direct assault on the city would be suicidal, given its position and defences, so he instead cut a swathe through the surrounding country, with John of Worcester stating that the Normans, quote, laid waste Sussex, Kent, Hampshire, Middlesex and Hertfordshire, and did not cease from burning townships and slaying men. William then encamped at Wallingford, another important military target and crossing point of the River Thames, given it was a place, quote, where the housecarls lived, according to the later Domesday Book, some of those elite, axe-wielding warriors who had so doggedly stood against William's relentless charges at Hastings. It was at Wallingford that another significant submission came. Stigand, the controversial Archbishop of Canterbury, submitted to William and renounced Edgar. With his ecclesiastical base of Canterbury already taken, and the proverbial writing on the wall, Stigand perhaps hoped to remain in post by submitting now. Stigand is an interesting figure in and of himself, having become Archbishop in 1052, following his role in resolving a political crisis between the then King Edward and the Godwinsons. The papacy had rejected his holding the office due to his simultaneously holding Winchester, and also because he replaced Robert of Jumièges, Edward's Norman archbishop, who was forced to flee in the same year due to his opposition to the Godwinsons. Given Stigand's controversial position, he was even depicted as presiding over Harold's coronation in the Bayeux Tapestry, though it's highly doubtful the archbishop really crowned him, given his uncertain legitimacy, and this was likely Norman propaganda to further undermine Harold's claim. The man who most likely did crown William's rival did not follow suit. Aldred, Archbishop of York, still held out for Edgar in London, and so William's campaign of ravaging the surrounding land continued, with arguably the breaking point coming with the desertion of the young King Edgar's greatest supporters, Edwin and Morcar, who, according to John of Worcester, quote, withdrew their support and returned home with their army. With the support of the great northern earls withdrawn, Edgar, along with a delegation of magnates and bishops, finally made their way to Berkhamsted to submit to William the Bastard directly and surrendered hostages to that effect. This moment was significant. At this time the English kingship was in theory still elective. In January of 1066 the great magnates had assented to Harold's kingship, despite him having no blood connection to his predecessor Edward the Confessor or any tie to the royal House of Wessex. Edgar Atheling had been acclaimed, if not crowned, by the magnates and leaders of London. Surely now this open and public acceptance by the remaining magnates and Edgar himself meant that William was now king. This may have been the way of the English. However, to Norman and continental eyes, a king was made at his coronation. The decision to be crowned so quickly was probably as much a military one as any greedy wish for William's followers to be rewarded with the spoils of war. Only the southeast of England was properly subjugated to William's rule, so his formal accession was essential to solidify his position. When William finally arrived in London, it must have been a powder keg of tension. As aforementioned, the city was full of survivors from Hastings, along with some of their relatives, so that they could hardly have welcomed William with open arms. The coronation itself occurred on Christmas Day, 1066. William stayed at King Edward the Confessor's palace in Westminster, and the ceremony took place in the Abbey. A sizable escort of armed and mounted Normans guarded the new king outside of the Abbey. Anthems praising the new king was sung by the mixed English and Norman audience that couldn't have been more than a couple of hundred people due to space restrictions. According to John of Worcester, William had promised to defend the church and its rulers, to govern the whole people justly, and to establish and maintain law, totally forbidding rapine and unjust judgments. But no sooner had he sworn to do so did Norman actions prove contrary to his words. As part of the ceremony, the question was put to William's new subjects in attendance if they accepted him as king, first by Aldred, the Archbishop of York, in English, and then by a Norman bishop in French, to which everyone naturally shouted, "Yes." Unfortunately, the Norman guards outside mistook the clamour and collective shout of acclamation for trouble, and began torching all the houses nearby in response. The scene must have been chaotic and somewhat bizarre. The attendees panicked and rushed outside as the fires spread. Archbishop Aldred and the remaining clergy, however, remained, anointed King William with holy oil, and placing the crown on his head, blessing William and granting him a peaceful rule. As the ceremony drew to a close, King William, according to Orderic Vitalis, could be seen trembling from head to foot. William the Bastard was now King of England, but resistance to his newly minted rule was far from extinguished.